So for the gospel reading, I've chosen a passage from John's gospel in chapter 16, and it's at the Last Supper. So at this stage, Christ has in the next 24 hours, he's going to be captured and tortured and killed, and within 72 hours, a resurrection. So in this short little passage, there's this dance between grief and joy. Again and again and again, the two words are interchanged. Truly, truly, I say to you, that you will weep and lament, but the world will rejoice. You will grieve, but your grief will be turned into joy. Whenever a woman is in labor, she has pain because her hour has come. But when she gives birth to the child, she no longer remembers the anguish because of the joy that a child has been born into the world. Therefore, you too have grief now. But I will see you again, and your heart will rejoice, and no one will take your joy away from you. In that day, you will not question me about anything. Truly, truly, I say to you, if you ask the Father for anything in my name, he will give it to you. Until now, you've asked for nothing in my name. Ask, and you will receive, so that your joy may be full. These things I have spoken to you in figurative language. An hour is coming when I will no longer speak to you in figurative language, but will tell you plainly of the Father. These are words inspired by God. So in my life, I've had the privilege of attending the birth of a child on 3 occasions. The first time was just to watch. The second time was to actually assist. And the third time was to deliver the child. So the first one was about 1973. I was living in a little mission in Kenya called Eldama Ravine. And it was a small little town. And the Sisters of Mercy from Cork City in Ireland, where I was from, had founded a hospital in Eldama Ravine. And the sister who was in charge was a sister called Sister Augustine. And I had known her when I grew up in Cork because my mother had worked in the same hospital as Sister Augustine, St. Finbarr's Hospital in Cork City. And now Augustine was a missionary in Kenya and she'd founded this hospital. And she told me that she believed that everybody needed to witness the miracle of birth. And moreover, everybody should know how to assist in case of a crisis in a birth situation. And so the first time I got just to watch a delivery, as she delivered a little baby, and look at the extraordinary wonder of life. Several months later, in the same mission, Eldama Ravine, we had a big generator on the compound that gave electricity to the whole compound. There was no electricity in the little town. And on one occasion, we used to get a lot of lightning storms there. A lightning storm hit the generator and knocked it out. Right when the doctor, who was a German doctor, called Martin Straub, who's still a very good friend of mine. Martin Straub was just about to begin a cesarean section on a Tugan woman. And the whole system went down, all the lights went out. And so I had gone down to see if I could fix the generator, and I was pulled in to assist in the delivery. And so I had 2 jobs to do. The first one, literally, I was holding a hurricane lamp, a storm lamp, so that Martin could continue with the cesarean section. And my job, the second job, was to speak to this woman because I spoke Tugan, to try to distract her from what was happening. Because in a cesarean section, it's only a local anesthetic. And so I'm holding the lamp and I'm talking to this woman as Martin is delivering the baby. Gratefully, the baby came out well and became a very healthy little child. The third time was about 4 or 5 years later, and I'm living in a different mission, a mission that I founded, a mission called Cabernet. And I had built the mission house there actually in the shape of a Celtic cross. And my mother had come out from Ireland on a visit because of the opening of this new mission. And she brought me a gift of 2 big fluffy bath towels. And then she went home. A few weeks later, a man comes into the mission. That was quite common. His wife was in labor and was having real difficulties away out in a remote area. And so I had a Land Cruiser, a Toyota pickup at the time, 4-wheel drive pickup. And after Augustine's advice, I always carried a first aid kit with me. And so he sits into it, I sit in, and we drive about 10 miles out into the bush. And we take this woman really, really pregnant and in a lot of pain. So I'm sitting in the driver's seat, which in Kenya is the right-hand side. The woman is in the middle and the husband is on the left-hand side. And there's no road, so it's really, really bumpy. And after about 2 miles, the woman starts screaming, "It's coming, it's coming, it's coming." So I stop the truck, I get out, the husband gets out, I get one of the blankets, put it on the seat, and she lies down. And within 10 minutes, the baby comes out. And I had learned what I had learned. And so I tied off the umbilical cord in 2 places with string that I kept, and then cut in between the 2 pieces. And the reason is that if you don't clamp it off, the placenta will keep bleeding and the mother will lose a lot of blood. So I clamped it off, cut it, and then took the baby, wrapped it in one of the bath towels, and gave it back to the mother. And then I went back into the driver's seat. She sat in the middle with the baby, and her husband on the left, and we drove to the hospital. So I have the same kind of feeling happening right now in our world. I've said this to you many, many, many times, that I think that planet Earth, whom I call Gaia, is giving birth to the next stage of our evolution. Initially, she gave birth to Homo habilis, and then Homo erectus, and then Homo sapiens, and then Homo sapiens sapiens. And I'm saying that she's ready to give birth to what I call Homo Spiritualis, a new breed of human beings which is operating out of compassion and out of love. But at the moment, there's pandemonium around the birthing right now. I want you to imagine a labor ward in which there's a doula, and there's a midwife, and there's a doctor, and a whole bunch of family members, and a whole bunch of strangers, all crowded into the labor ward, and they're all screaming directions and accusations and abuse. That, no, you're doing it wrong. That's not the way. This is the way to do it. Everybody screaming at everybody else and shouting at the mother, "Why the hell did you even choose to get pregnant?" And that's the state we're in right now. But Gaia is attempting to birth Homo Spiritualis. And what Gaia needs is a global community that can create serenity and peace and love and compassion and silence so that the baby can be delivered in a healthy way. And that's what I want to talk about this morning. I'll make 4 main points this morning. The first point I'll call it thinking about thinking. Secondly, I want to talk about suicide by Tulpa. Thirdly, I'll call it blowing love bubbles. And fourthly, how to dance with the shadow. So they're the 4 points I'll make this morning. I'm a prodigious dreamer, and I've been recording my dreams since 1978. And often I find that some of the best ideas I think I have come in my dreams. So a few nights ago, I had this dream, and in the dream, I'm wrestling with a question. And the question is, where do thoughts come from? What gives rise to a thought? And in the dream, it seemed the answer that was suggested was that thought is simply a conversation between the ego and the soul, between our immanence, our incarnated immanence, and our transcendence, between our temporal existence in incarnation and our eternal being. It's a conversation. Every thought is a conversation that's happening between these 2 parts of ourselves. And so thought is the union of the ego and the soul. It's a zygote which is conceived by a soul sperm and an ego egg. That's its origin. But there's a problem, because the agenda of the ego, of every creature on the planet, every animal on the planet, has the agenda of survival and self-reproduction. That's what every animal species attempts to do, including us human beings. So that's the function of the ego, survival and self-replication. However, the agenda of the soul is very, very different. The agenda of the soul is unity, consciousness, and unconditional love. And now we got a problem, because during incarnation, these 2 agendas are trying to dock with each other. An agenda that tells us it's about personal survival and about, feeding myself, surviving myself, and reproducing myself. And the agenda of the soul that says we're bite-sized pieces of God. We're souls on safari on planet Earth. We're spirits in space suits. And there is a unity consciousness and an unconditional love. So that was my understanding of the thoughts that come. They come because of the dialogue and the conversation that continues to exist between your eternal essence, your soul, and your ego. That's the first point I want to make. The second point then, I call it suicide by tulpa. So in the case of human beings, for 9 months, the fetus is completely controlled by the mother. The mother is feeding it, and exuding all the toxic waste from the baby through the umbilical cord. So it's totally dependent upon the mother. But then it's born and it's separated, and very, very quickly it develops a will of its own. And then the issues begin. The battle between, the mother and the child, the ego and the terrible twos. And I believe the same thing happens with our thinking and our thoughts. Initially, our thoughts are controlled by the thinker. So I, who am having the thoughts, am in control of the thoughts that I'm having. But at some stage, these thoughts get born, they separate out from the person who's thinking it, and they develop an agenda of their own. And Buddhism will call this a tulpa. So a tulpa is a thought that gains its independence from the thinker. Now it can be in relationship with the thinker, just like the baby can be in relationship with the mother, but it's still separate from it. And when there's a thought or a tulpa to which we go back regularly, we attend to it regularly, and we have intentions around it on a regular basis, it becomes a very powerful entity. And in fact, it can overpower the ego and ignore the soul completely. And that's what you kind of get. Anybody who can make the statement, I hate myself. How can you make the statement that you hate yourself? So what's happening here? What's happening is that a tulpa is in conflict with the ego, which has generated it. And so this kind of the schism happens between the thinker and the thought. Now, like an antisocial teenager sometimes, this tulpa can make friends with other tulpa makers in the area and form kind of street gangs that can terrorize entire neighborhoods. And I would call that propaganda, or memes, the memes that drive our cultures. So what happens is a whole bunch of negative thinking gets together, negative tulpas get together, and they literally create street gangs. And it seems to me that for over 5,000 years, these negative tulpas have roamed the earth. And depending on our technology, initially these tulpas would just take up cudgels and beat somebody else with them. Now these tulpas are much more powerful because they have weapons of mass destruction available to them. And that is what I call then suicide by tulpa. It's the suicide that we can create as individuals, as communities, as nations, and as a globe. These tulpas of feeding negative thoughts on a regular basis so that they finally take over the mindset of the entire planet. Now, the truth is that a tulpa can be a good or a bad thing. So our job then is to create or give birth to tulpas that result in mystics being born, not monsters being born. Our job is to birth beauty, not to birth bedlam. And so we have to be really, really careful about the tulpas to which we give birth, which means we have to be really cognizant of the constant conversation that goes on interiorly between the soul self and the ego self. That we have to generate tulpas of love and compassion. That would be my second point. A few days ago, I'm out trekking where I live. I'm 5 miles up a dirt road and just the dirt tracks. And somehow I began thinking about cartoon characters that I used to read as a child on the newspapers. There was a cartoon character called Mutt and Jeff, big tall guy and a small fat little guy. And what I remembered a few days ago is that it was an ingenious device. Rather than tell you in written form, here's what Jeff said and here's what Mutt said in response to him, they would create little bubbles of dialogue, and they'd print inside the bubble what Mutt was saying, and then print inside a different bubble what Jeff was saying, and there'd be pointers so that you realized who was saying what. But then there was another device. So if Mutt was just thinking something but not speaking it, there would be a bubble and then a kind of a concatenation of little bubbles, like a chain of little bubbles going down to his head. And that was to indicate to you that he's thinking these things, but he's not speaking these things. And so when I think about it, it's as if like our thoughts go out. If they're negative tulpas, then they're dark, murky kinds of bubbles. If they're prayers, they go out as bright, love-filled bubbles. And so I began to think, why don't I try a new practice for myself? And if this makes sense to you, you can do it as well. And I call it composing a love bubble or a love tulpa. And there would be 3 parts to it. So that I would sit down every morning, soon after I get up, and I would draw a little piece on a page. I would draw a loving statement, put a bubble around it, and then send it off in the ether to some friend of mine. So here's the wish, and here's the prayer I have for this friend of mine. And it could be a different person each time, or I could do several people during the day. The second one would be to draw a love bubble and to write a statement of forgiveness and compassion and peace, and to send it through the ether through to an enemy of mine, somebody I'm having difficulty with. But that I create a love bubble or a love tulpa, and I send it out into the ether. And the third version with me would be, I'm going to call it a warrior bubble. And so I would create a statement of beauty and love and compassion and send it out there to seek for some anger-filled tulpa someplace in the world, to surround it and to escort it out of the global mindset in the same way that the body's immune system isolates and escorts out of the body, what is not good for the body. So it's like a new practice in some way. Now, in some senses, I'm just reinventing the wheel, except I'm doing it in some kind of a graphic form, because this idea obviously exists. In Buddhism, there's a beautiful prayer called metta meditation, where you make 4 statements for 6 targets. And the 4 statements are, may you be free from all harm, may you be truly happy, may you be healthy and strong, may you be in alignment with God. And the 6 targets are, firstly myself, then a friend, then a mentor, then a neutral person, then a difficult person, and finally, all sentient beings. So what I'm saying exists already, except I'm talking about some kind of doing it in a graphic format. It exists in another Buddhist practice, which is called Tonglen. And Tonglen is the breathing in the pain of the world, transforming it in the crucible of your loving heart, and then breathing it out as compassion and love. It's called Tonglen. And of course, Jesus said exactly the same thing. Love your enemies. Pray for those who persecute you. So they're saying exactly the same thing, except they beat me to it by 2,000 years or 2,500 years. But for me, how it helped me was, it's a little graphic where I can, in the morning, just create 3 or 4 bubbles, fill them with loving statements, and then send them off into the ether. So that's my 3rd point. My 4th point I'll call how to dance with the shadow. That day, which is 3 or 4 days ago, as I'm walking along this little track, and I had just had this idea of, blowing love bubbles into the world, I came around a little corner in the track, and all of a sudden, I see this perfect circle on the track right in front of me. And I'm amazed. It looked like a medicine wheel. In Native American Indian tradition, they have this system called a medicine wheel. So the 4 cardinal directions are pointed out, but it's a circle. And when you step into the circle, you create medicine, or you create healing for anybody who seeks it. And it was interesting that literally within seconds of having this idea about the love bubbles, I found this on the road right in front of me. I'm looking around to find out what created that. And then I realized that it's a very bright day. It was like about 93 degrees Fahrenheit at the time. And I live in a forest. And so there's trees all around the track. And there was this one tree, and the trunk was going up at an angle, kind of curving around. And then one of the limbs was continuing the curve, and then it was picking up another little shrub on the ground, and it was completing the circle. And the sun was causing this to create an image of a circle on the ground. It was a kind of a dappled circle. And so I stepped into it, and I prayed there for a while. So I looked at this, what I would describe as like a trinity of dancers. The shadow creating the image of the circle because of the presence of the sun. And it reminded me of a great lecture I heard years and years and years ago by an American physicist who was visiting Palo Alto, a guy called Bernard Hesch. And he talked about an idea which he called creation by subtraction. And it reminded me of a great phrase in Hamlet, the character Polonius, who says, by indirection, find direction out. And I realized that sometimes the most important piece of an article is the piece that's missing, the piece that's not there. So for instance, the most important part of a cup is the part of the cup that's not there, the space in the middle. Otherwise you couldn't be able to drink from it. Or the most important part of a door is the opening, not the wooden door itself, but the opening that allows you to go through. So what I saw was that the shadow on the ground was created by the light in order to form an image. So all parts were necessary. You needed the light and the obstacle, and the shadow to create the image. And it reminds me that when you go to watch a movie, and there's a projectionist box up at the back, and it's running pure light through a celluloid film, and you're seeing images on the screen. What you don't realize is that it is not the light that's creating the images on the screen, it's the absence of light that's creating the images on the screen. It's the part of the frame, the celluloid frame, which is obfuscated, or darkened out. That's the part that's actually creating the images on the screen. And then I understood what Bernard Heesch was saying. It's creation by subtraction. By subtracting the light, in some senses, you're creating the image on the screen. Now, the light actually is necessary, obviously, but it's the part where the light isn't getting through. That's actually what you're watching on the screen. So all parts have become really important. So shadow then is created when an obstacle blocks the sun, whether that obstacle is an umbrella or a tree or a building. And I began thinking then about these three elements and coming to the realization that the sun is God, and the obstacles are life experiences, and the images created are the healing lessons. So the sun is God, the obstacles are life experiences, and the images are the healing lessons being offered to us. And in our world right now, currently, the sun is shining as brightly as ever. There's no diminution of the sun's power right now. But the obstacles are bigger, and therefore, the lessons are more important. So somebody said at one stage, things are getting worse and worse, and better, faster and faster. And that's my experience as well, as we're attempting to birth Homo Spiritualis. Now, we're going to have to deal with this reality, these three parts, the sun, the obstacles, and the shadows, images. We're going to have to keep dealing with those until we become enlightened beings. And in some senses, that's a pun. When you get fully enlightened, there is no longer any need for obstacles and shadows in order to form images and learn lessons. When we're fully enlightened beings, there is no need anymore for the obstacles or the shadows in order to form images and in order to learn the lessons. But until that time arrives, until as an individual you're enlightened, or as a culture we're enlightened, or as a species we're enlightened, we're going to have to learn to work with the obstacles and the shadows by factoring in the sunlight beforehand. Carl Jung wrote very famously about the shadow. And Carl Jung claimed that the shadow is 80% gold and 20% repressed traumata. So he said it's 80% gold in the sense that the shadow consists of 80% of unrealized potential for the individual and about 20% of repressed trauma. So if I were to use my own languaging for that, I would say that the shadow is 80% light and 20% tulpa. Now, shadows are really, really important. We need to be able to learn how to work with the shadow material. And so shadows convert two-dimensional paintings into three-dimensional images. If you didn't have shadows in a painting, it would be a flat two-dimensional effort. It's the shadows that you create, the gradations of color that create the depth and the perspective. So shadow becomes very, very important in creating a work of art. Now, I believe that if we learn during incarnation, if we can learn to live lovingly, we can convert three-dimensional physical life into six-dimensional soul life. Just as shadow, turns two-dimensional drawings into three-dimensional art, loving compassion can turn three-dimensional physical life into six-dimensional soul life. Another realization I had as I was standing in that medicine circle was that when you walk in the light, the only shadow that follows you is your own shadow. As you're walking in the light, there's only one shadow following you, and that's your own shadow. And so it seemed to me that there are three lessons that come from this realization, or three caveats. The first one is, don't focus on the shadow of others. Secondly, don't project your own shadow onto somebody else. And thirdly, don't allow other people to project their shadow onto you. And I think that this lesson has to be learned, at many different levels. It has to be learned at an interpersonal level between individual peoples, that there's no point in me focusing on your shadow if I'm in a relationship with you. And it's worse if I project my shadow onto you. And it's bad if I allow you to project your shadow onto me and to take it aboard and to feel shame and guilt because you're projecting your shadow onto me. The same thing I believe is true of communities. It is not okay to focus on the shadow material for one community to focus on the shadow material of another community. It is not okay for one community to project its shadow on another community. And it is not okay for a community to accept and allow others to project their shadows onto us. And the same thing is true at an international level, between nations. It is not okay for a nation to focus just on the shadow material of another nation. And it is not okay for a nation to project its shadow onto another nation. And it is certainly not okay for any nation to accept the projection, the shadow material from a third nation. That doesn't work. And so I find ourselves today at this stage, we're assisting a mother who is in labor. And there's many ways of being in that labor ward. We can be there, screaming or shouting or accusing each other or creating cacophony. And we could be there with serenity and love and with prayers. You choose the tulpa that you want to operate out of. Namaste.
Question from Eric.
My question is, in regards to Homo Spiritualis that you talked about, how close would you say that we are right now? And is there a certain percentage of the population that would need to be a mystic or enlightened for that to happen? Or is it something that it's really unpredictable? I'm just curious if you could elaborate on that.
Sure, it's a great question. So I told you many, many times in the past that I had this really powerful vision many years ago of soul standing in God's presence and volunteering for incarnation. And this great soul called Gaia volunteered and said to God, I want you to send me to that third rock from the sun in that solar system, and I will breathe life on it until I manage to throw up a life form which becomes aware of its own divinity, and ipso facto, the divinity of all other life forms with which it shares the planet. And she said about it 3.7 billion years ago, she began to breathe life on planet Earth. And we went from single-celled amoebas to multicellular life forms. And then we went to kind of sea creatures, marine life. And then we came to amphibians. And then we came to reptiles. And then to mammals. And then to hominids. And among the hominids, we had, Homo habilis, Homo erectus, Homo sapiens, and then Homo Sapiens Sapiens. So we're actually on the brink of this breakthrough into Homo Spiritualis. But again, I've said how we handle this transition is going to lead to one of two conditions, either Homo Spiritualis or Homo Sociopathicus. And Homo Sociopathicus is going to feed on anger and greed and warfare, whereas Homo Spiritualis is going to feed on love and compassion and forgiveness. So we're at this bifurcation point. And we have been here, I would say perhaps for maybe 5,000 years. Now, the question becomes will there be a preponderance of loving tulpas going out or a preponderance of anger? How are we stoking this movement? And it's not a given. There's no guarantee. It's quite possible that we will destroy this experiment, either in a nuclear holocaust or in ecological degradation or in internecine warfare of some kinds, that we'll destroy this experiment. And Gaia will just, breed another species, that will take the niche and finally make the breakthrough. When I look at human history, I actually believe that human history is much, much older than the historians or the archaeologists believe in. that there are actually cycles, what the Hindus will call Mahayugas, great cycles of time. The golden age, the silver age, the bronze age, and the iron age, each getting darker and darker and darker until we break through again. And there's actually evidence that civilization did not just begin in 3,800 BCE with the Sumerians, but that we've been around this course many times before. I saw a fascinating program a few days ago about an astrophysicist who's looking at some of the ancient monuments on planet Earth, like the pyramids, or Jerusalem, or Mecca. And what he figured out was that there have been shifts in the Earth's crust. So if you imagine the Earth is like a huge orange, the skin is only 7 miles thick. The orange itself, the radius of the orange is 4,000 miles. So the diameter is 8,000 miles, but the skin is only 7 miles thick, the top layer, the crust. And sometimes it shifts positions. While the interior is stable, it's like you took the skin of the orange and rotated it, and the skin is separated from the interior. So the interior doesn't move, but the skin does move. And he was able to calculate that the North Pole has been in 3 different locations over the last 100,000 years. And at looking at some of the great ancient monuments, he could see again and again and again that all of these monuments are oriented to a previous position on the North Pole. So the North Pole went from the Hudson Bay to the Bering Straits to where it is right now. And so if you retroact, you can work backwards from that scenario, you'll find that some of these monuments are pointing to the North Pole, because very often they pointed to Polaris. You can deduce that many of these extraordinary artifacts, these stone monuments, go back 100,000 years. So I think actually we've been in this place several times, and we've blown it again and again and again. So it's like we have another chance as a civilization. Are we going to blow this one? And will we get another chance to do it? Or at this stage, will Gaia throw up her hand and say, I tried with Homo sapiens, and it really didn't work. I'm going to kind of favor another species, and that will work. So there is absolutely no guarantee, Eric, that we're going to make the breakthrough. But certainly, if we continue to shout abuse at each other and call names and project our shadow material, it's certainly not going to happen. So there have to be enough people who are sitting serenely in meditation and sending out these warrior tulpas, to encapsulate and escort out of the global mindset this kind of darkness. Unless we do that in larger numbers, we're facing an extinction point in some senses. And even if that were to happen, I really believe that if we were to become extinct as a species, there are many different energy levels, to this experiment. So we tend to identify with the most dense level of it, what the Hindus will call the gross body, which is vibrating between 400 and 700 nanometers between infrared and ultraviolet. But we exist at many different levels above that. We exist at an etheric level, the auric level. We exist at the astral level. We exist at the mental level. We exist at the causal level, we exist at the soul level, and ultimately we exist, in cosmic consciousness at source. And so even if the species were to go extinct, I believe that the souls who have tried really hard to raise Homo Sapiens Sapiens to Homo Spiritualis, they will simply inhabit a different level of these 7 stages. So they may not, be physically present on the planet, but they're still present etherically, or astrally, or mentally, or causally, or spiritually to the process. So nobody ever dies. We simply change our state of consciousness. And that's true of individuals, it's true of cultures, and it's true of our world.
I'm going to call on James.
Father Sean, you talked about the shadow that is cast is the lesson that we learn from our experience.
Right.
And you say, don't let your shadow be imposed on somebody else.
Right.
But if we've learned a lesson, how do we share it without imposing our shadow on them?
That's a great question, James. Great question. And so the purpose of the shadow is to give me an image with which I can work so that I can do my personal healing work. Other people need to be working with their own shadows. Now, if somebody invites me in Let's say, for instance, you're a physician, James. Somebody invites you in because they're having eye issues. So in some senses, they're dealing with their shadow material by bringing aboard somebody who's an expert in helping them to deal with their own shadow. I'm a clinical psychologist as well. Part of what I do as a clinical psychologist and part of what I do as a priest is that I'm working with my own shadow material, and that gives me the experience to be able to help other people who are working with their material. But I have to be really, really careful that I don't engage in what in psychology we call counter-transference. That obviously in any relationship, there's going to be some kind of a transference happening. Either somebody idealizes you or demonizes you. So we're projecting two different kinds of shadow material. Idealization, you become a hero to me, or darkness, you become a demon to me. So I have to help you, if you ask me, to work with your shadow material. But I can't go in, and do counter-transference where I dump my stuff on you in order to help you. If I dump my stuff on you, I'm not helping you. If you invite me in so that you have a second kind of opinion on the shadow that you're dealing with, then we can go places. Because there's a hierarchy in nature. All of nature is hierarchically arranged. But it's not a hierarchy of domination or control. It's a hierarchy of competence. So if I want an ophthalmologist, I'm going to look for you. I'm not going to go to a welder in a body shop and ask him to do it for me. If you want to deliver a baby, you're going to get a midwife or a doula to do it. You're not going to just drag somebody in off the street and say, go for it, you're in charge. So there's a hierarchy of competence, which is really important. And so recognizing that there are people, somewhere in that hierarchy of competence, not of control, not of dominance, but of competence, you're going to invite somebody in and say, okay, here's what I'm wrestling with. And the person who comes in with the competence, the job is not to kind of bring their own shadow material and dump it. It's to deal with the shadow material that the person has recognized in themselves and are seeking help from.
Go ahead, Teresa.
Oh, Sean, I had, I guess, just a comment on the shadow. I was reflecting yesterday and realized that I've been doing a lot of gardening since February. And I realized that, in a sense, what I've sort of learned and worked through has to do, with what Jung calls the golden shadow.
Yes.
And I think in that area, it's, positive things that we learn that we don't even realize we might learn, or our talents or whatever else. And I'm someone who, I can be patient about things that I'm familiar with, but I also can be very impatient. I kind of like things right now. And with doing the work in the yard, the fact that we had all this time that was kind of with no end in sight, I've realized that I didn't need to have, I didn't have deadlines. In other words, I could just do the work as needed. And so I worked my way around the yard and was a little bit amazed at how long each section took. But I just kept at it slowly. And, and so one week I might work an hour, another week I might work 6 hours. There was a month that I did nothing. And then in the end, things are more or less done. But, in a garden, nothing's ever done. But what I found was that I really got a whole new angle on patience and what it takes to do, for me, a long-term project. We all have different talents and abilities in terms of how we go about, whether we, how do you put it? Some people really know how to tackle a long-term project. For me, this is something that I needed to learn. And so I just wanted to throw that in because I feel like, this was a lesson that I didn't know I needed to learn.
That's a great comment, Teresa. So let me just make a quick response to two parts of what you just said. The first one, there's Jesus is a master of paradoxical parables. Mm-hmm. He says things which on the face of it look like kind of ridiculous. So he tells this great parable one time about a very rich man, who had people working for him, and he had a vineyard. And he went on a journey, a long journey, and he put a steward in charge of his property.
Mm.
And because he didn't come back, very, very quickly, the steward began to lord it over the other workers and to abuse them, and finally he was even cooking the books. And finally, the master was told, your steward is embezzling your property. And he called in the steward and he said, give me an account of your stewardship, because you can't be steward anymore, because you've been embezzling my property. And the guy thinks, what am I going to do? I'm too old, to dig ditches. I'm too embarrassed to kind of beg for money. What am I going to do? I know what I'll do. I'll call in all of my master's debtors and I will have their bills, so that when I'm thrown out, I'll go to their homes and they'll welcome me in. And Christ ended that parable with this extraordinary paradoxical statement. He said, the master praised the unjust steward insofar as he had acted wisely, because the children of this generation are wiser to their kind than the children of light. Now, what in God's name does that mean? Here's how I unpack it. For me, it's this. The master is not praising the duplicity of the steward. He's saying, look at what this guy did. He was able to turn every situation to his own economic advantage. When I was away, he was cooking the books. But when I fired him, he was able to turn that into a situation where he could now depend on the largesse of people whose debts he had slashed in half. And what is Christ saying? He's saying, you must be able to turn every situation to your own spiritual advantage. There is nothing that happens in your life which cannot be harvested, for virtue and for growth. And that's what you're discovering just very, very simply in your own garden. That this lockdown, there are lots of ways of dealing with it. And one of the ways is, how do I harvest it for personal growth? So that's the first point you made, and it's beautiful. The second one, you used the word patience, the patience with yourself. And it's fascinating to me that in some of the Romance languages, the word patience in English is translated as pax scientia, which literally means the science of peacemaking. Patience is the science of making peace with yourself and with your world. Being able to live in the middle, to live in the eye of the hurricane or the storm and find equanimity.
Welcome, Michael.
One of the things you said is to not project shadow onto others. And it seems to me that it's a helpful step sometimes to project this ideal image onto somebody else so that you can see what's possible, or to project this negative sort of image onto others so that you can see it within yourself. And so it seems to me that it's good to be able to take this first step, but you need to let go of that. And I'm wondering if you could shed some more light.
Yeah, that's a great question, because when Carl Jung came up with the idea of projection, he saw projection as the first stage in a two-stage process. So the first stage is projection, and the second stage he called retrojection. So I'll use a very simple example. If you want to see a movie, there are two ways of seeing a movie. You go into the theater, sit in a comfortable seat, and watch the big screen in front of you, 40 feet by 40 feet. And you can see very clearly the images, you can see the change, you can see the motion whatsoever. Or you could go up into the projectionist box, and you could take the roll of celluloid film, and you could go through it frame by frame by frame, and you're seeing the same movie. Except a really, really boring way to see it, because from frame to frame, there's no discernible change in it, and it's very, very tiny. And so by projecting it onto a huge screen, you get the illusion of movement and time change and size. But if you think the action is happening up there, and I told you one time about an event that happened to me as a small child. There was a movie theater in Cork City called the Lido. And in case you think of, some great Italian theater with plush seats, it was a barn of a building with wooden seats and a concrete, screen just painted white. And the price of admission for kids on a Saturday morning to matinees was 2 milk bottles. The milk was delivered in bottles. You had to wash out the bottles and bring it back, recycled, and that's how you got in. But we'd fill our pockets with stones. And we'd always like either cowboy movies or Tarzan movies. And when the bad guy came on screen and the good guy didn't notice, we take out our stones and we start pelting the screen and say, look out behind you, watch out, the baddie is going to get you. And then the lights would come on and a big burly steward would come in and kick out 3 or 4 kids at random. And then the lights would go back down and the movie would start again. And after 2 or 3 minutes, we get so excited, we would really think that we could assist the good guy and protecting from the bad guy by throwing stones at the screen. Now that's what projection is. So when we believe our projections, rather than realizing the projection is simply a mechanism, the first stage in a two-stage process, so that I can see very, very clearly by projecting and enlarging the image, I can see where it's coming from, which is inside me. So it becomes very important that as I project it, this is done silently and consciously, but I don't act on it. I don't now behave as if the problem is out there, and by throwing stones at the people out there, I can solve the issue in here. So you're absolutely right. The projection is very important, but it has to be done consciously, silently, and as a first stage in a two-stage process.